Vol.2 Chapter 22 of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Vol.2 Chapter 22. But now the hand of fate is on the curtain, and gives the scene to light. Don Sebastian. I felt stunned and chilled as they retired. Imagination, dwelling on an absent object of affection, paints her not only in the fairest light, but in that which we most desire to behold her. I had thought of Diana as she was, with her parting tear dropped on my cheek, when her parting token, received from the wife of MacGregor, augured her wish to convey into exile and conventual seclusion the remembrance of my affection. I saw her, and her cold passive manner, expressive of little except composed melancholy, disappointed, and, in some degree, almost offended me. In the egotism of my feelings, I accused her of indifference, of insensibility. I upbraided her father with pride, with cruelty, with fanaticism, forgetting that both were sacrificing their interest, and Diana her inclination, to the discharge of what they regarded as their duty. Sir Frederick Vernon was a rigid Catholic, who thought the path of salvation too narrow to be trodden by a heretic, and Diana, to whom her father's safety had been for many years the principal and moving spring of thoughts, hopes, and actions, felt that she had discharged her duty in resigning to his will, not alone her property in the world, but the dearest affections of her heart. But it was not surprising that I could not, at such a moment, fully appreciate these honourable motives. Yet my spleen sought no ignoble means of discharging itself. "I am condemned, then," I said when I left to run over the tenor of Sir Frederick's communications. "I am condemned, and thought unworthy even to exchange words with her. Be it so. They shall not at least prevent me from watching over her safety. Here will I remain as an outpost, and while under my roof at least, no danger shall threaten her, if it be such as an arm of one determined man can avert." I summoned Syddall to the library. He came, but came attended by the eternal Andrew, who, dreaming of great things in consequence of my taking possession of the hall of the annexed estates, was resolved to lose nothing for want of keeping himself in view, and, as often happens to men who entertain selfish objects, overshot his mark and rendered his attentions tedious and inconvenient. His unrequired presence prevented me from speaking freely to Syddall, and I dared not send him away for fear of increasing such suspicions as he might entertain from his former abrupt dismissal from the library. "I shall sleep here, sir," I said, giving them directions to wheel nearer to the fire an old-fashioned day-bed, or settee. "I have much to do, and shall go late to bed." Syddall, who seemed to understand my look, offered to procure me the accommodation of a mattress and some bedding. I accepted his offer, dismissed my attendant, lighted a pair of candles, and desired that I might not be disturbed till 7 in the ensuing morning. The domestics retired, leaving me to my painful, ill-arranged reflections, until nature, worn out, should require some repose. I endeavoured forcibly to abstract my mind from the singular circumstances in which I found myself placed. Feelings which I had gallantly combated while the exciting object was remote, were now exasperated by my immediate neighbourhood to her whom I was so soon to part with for ever. Her name was written in every book which I attempted to peruse, and her image forced itself in me in whatever train of thought I strove to engage myself. It was like the officious slave of Prior Solomon. "Abra was ready ere I named her name, and when I called another, Abra came." I alternately gave way to these thoughts, and struggled against them, sometimes yielding to a mood of melting tenderness of sorrow which was scarce natural to me, sometimes arming myself with the hurt pride of one who has experienced what he esteemed unmerited rejection. I paced the library, until I had chafed myself into a temporary fever. I then threw myself on the couch, and endeavoured to dispose myself to sleep, but it was in vain that I used every effort to compose myself, that I lay without movement of a finger or a muscle, as still as if I had been already a corpse, that I endeavoured to divert or banish disquieting thoughts, by fixing my mind on some act of repetition or arithmetical process. My blood throbbed to my feverish apprehension, in pulsations which resembled the deep and regular strokes of a distant fulling mill, and tingled in my veins like streams of liquid fire. At length I rose, opened the window, and stood by it for some time in the clear moonlight, receiving, in part at least, that refreshment and dissipation of ideas from the clear and calm scene, without which they had become beyond the command of my own volition. I resumed my place in the couch with a heart, heaven knows, not lighter, but firmer, and more resolved for endurance. In a short time a slumber crept over my senses. Still, however, though my senses slumbered, my soul was awake to the painful feelings of my situation, and my dreams were of mental anguish and external objects of terror. I remember a strange agony, under which I conceived myself and Diana in the power of MacGregor's wife, and about to be precipitated from a rock into the lake. The signal was to be the discharge of a cannon, fired by Sir Frederick Vernon, who, in the dress of a cardinal, officiated at the ceremony. Nothing could be more lively than the impression which I received of this imaginary scene. I could paint, even at this moment, the mute and courageous submission expressed in Diana's features, the wild and distorted faces of the executioners, who crowded around us with moping and mawing, grimaces ever changing, and each more hideous than that which preceded. I saw the rigid and inflexible fanaticism painted in the face of the father. I saw him lift the fatal match. The deadly signal exploded. It was repeated again and again and again, in rival thunders, by the echoes of the surrounding cliffs, and I awoke from fancied horror to real apprehension. The sounds in my dream were not ideal. They reverberated on my waking ears, but it was 2 or 3 minutes ere I could collect myself so as distinctly to understand that they proceeded from a violent knocking at the gate. I leapt from my couch in great apprehension, took my sword under my arm, and hastened to forbid the admission of any one. But my route was necessarily circuitous, because the library looked not upon the quadrangle, but into the gardens. When I had reached a staircase, the windows of which opened upon the entrance court, I heard the feeble and intimidated tones of Seidel expostulating with rough voices which demanded admittance, by the warrant of Justice Standish, and in the king's name, and threatened the old domestic with the heaviest penal consequences if he refused instant obedience. Ere they had ceased, I heard, to my unspeakable provocation, the voice of Andrew bidding Seidel stand aside, and let him open the door. "If they come in King George's name, we have naething to fear. We have spent baith blood and gall for him. We dinna need to dern ourselves like some folk, Mr. Seidel. We are neither Papists nor Jacobites, I trow." It was in vain I accelerated my pace downstairs. I heard bolt after bolt withdrawn by the officious scoundrel, while all the time he was boasting his own and master's loyalty to King George, and I could easily calculate that the party must enter before I could arrive at the door to replace the bars. Devoting the back of Andrew Fairservice to the cudgel so soon as I should have time to pay him his deserts, I ran back to the library, barricaded the door as best I could, and hastened to that by which Diana and her father entered, and begged for instant admittance. Diana herself undid the door. She was ready dressed, and betrayed neither perturbation nor fear. "Danger is so familiar to us," she said, "that we are always prepared to meet it. My father is already up. He is in Rashleigh's apartment. We will escape into the garden, and thence by the postern gate. I have the key from Seidel in case of need, into the wood, and know it dingles better than any one now alive. Keep them a few minutes in play, and, dear, dear Frank, once more, fare thee well." She vanished like a meteor to join her father, and the intruders were rapping violently, and attempting to force the library door by the time I had returned into it. "You robber dogs!" I exclaimed, wilfully mistaking the purpose of their disturbance. "If you do not instantly quit the house, I will fire my blunderbuss through the door." "Fire a fule's bauble," said Andrew Fairservice. "It's Mr. Clerk Jobson, with a legal warrant." "To search for, take, and apprehend," said the voice of that execrable pettifogger. The bodies of certain persons in my warrant named, charged of high treason under the 13th of King William, chapter 3rd. And the violence on the door was renewed. I am rising, gentlemen, said I, desirous to gain as much time as possible. Commit no violence, give me leave to look at your warrant, and if it is formal and legal, I shall not oppose it. God save great George our king, ejaculated Andrew. I told you that ye'd nae find Jacobites here. Spitting out the time as much as possible, I was at length compelled to open the door, which they would otherwise have forced. Mr. Jobson entered with several assistants, among whom I discovered the younger Wingfield, to whom, doubtless, he was obliged for his information, and exhibited his warrant, directed not only against Frederick Vernon, an attainted traitor, but also against Diana Vernon, spinster, and Francis Osbaldistone, gentleman, accused of misprision of treason. It was a case in which resistance would have been madness. I therefore, after capitulating for a few minutes' delay, surrendered myself a prisoner. I had next the mortification to see Jobson go straight to the chamber of Miss Vernon, and I learned that from thence, without hesitation or difficulty, he went to the room where Sir Frederick had slept. The hare has stolen away, said the brute, but her form is warm. The greyhounds will have her by the haunches yet. A scream from the garden announced that he prophesied too truly. In the course of 5 minutes, Rashleigh entered the library with Sir Frederick Vernon and his daughter as prisoners. The fox, he said, knew his old earth, but he forgot it could be stopped by a careful huntsman. I had not forgot the garden gate, Sir Frederick, or, if that title suits you better, most noble Lord Bilcombe. Rashleigh, said Sir Frederick, thou art a detestable villain. I better deserve the name Sir Knight, or my lord, when under the direction of an able tutor. I sought to introduce civil war into the bosom of peaceful country, but I have done my best, said he, looking upwards, to atone for my errors. I could hold no longer. I had deigned to watch their proceedings in silence, but I felt that I must speak or die. If hell, I said, has one complexion more hideous than another, it is where villainy is masked by hypocrisy. Ha, my gentle cousin, said Rashleigh, holding a candle towards me, and surveying me from head to foot. Right welcome to Osbaldistone Hall. I can forgive your spleen. It is hard to lose an estate and a mistress in one night, for we shall take possession of this poor manor house in the name of the lawful heir, Sir Rashleigh Osbaldistone. While Rashleigh braved it out in this manner, I could see that he put a strong force upon his feelings, both of anger and shame. But his state of mind was more obvious when Diana Vernon addressed him. Rashleigh, she said, I pity you, for, deep as the evil is which you have laboured to do me, and the evil you have actually done, I cannot hate you so much as I scorn and pity you. What you have now done may be the work of an hour, but will furnish you with reflection for your life, of what nature I leave to your own conscience, which will not slumber for ever. Rashleigh strode once or twice through the room, came up to the side table on which wine was still standing, and poured out a large glass with a trembling hand. But when he saw that we observed his tremor, he suppressed it by a strong effort, and, looking at us with fixed and daring composure, he carried the bumper to his head without spilling a drop. It is my father's old Burgundy, he said, looking to Jobson. I am glad there is some of it left. You will get proper persons to take care of old Butler, and that foolish Scotch rascal. Meanwhile, we will convey these persons to a more proper place of custody. I have provided the old family coach for your convenience, he said, though I am not ignorant that even the lady could brave the night air on foot or on horseback, were the errand more to her mind. Andrew wrung his hands. I only said that my master was surely speaking to a ghaist in the library, and the villain Lancy to betray an old friend that sang off the same psalm book with him for every Sabbath for 20 years. He was turned out of the house, together with Seidel, without being allowed to conclude his lamentation. His expulsion, however, led to some singular consequences. Resolving, according to his own story, to go down for the night where Mother Simpson would give him lodging for an old acquaintance's sake, he had just got clear of the avenue, and into the old wood, as it was called, though it was now used as a pasture ground rather than woodland, when he suddenly lighted on a drove of Scottish cattle, which were lying there to repose themselves after the day's journey. At this Andrew was in no way surprised, it being the well-known custom of his countrymen, who take care of those droves, to quarter themselves after night upon the best unenclosed grass ground they can find, and depart before daybreak to escape paying for their night's lodgings. But he was both surprised and startled when a Highlander, springing up, accused him of disturbing the cattle, and refused him to pass forward till he had spoken to his master. The mountaineer conducted Andrew into a thicket, where he found 3 or 4 more of his countrymen. "And," said Andrew, "I saw soon they were our moneymen for the drove, and from the questions they put to me, I judged they had other tow on their rock." They questioned him closely about all that had passed at Osbaldistone Hall, and seemed surprised and concerned at the report he made to them. "And truth," said Andrew, "I told them a kind, for dirks and pistols were what I could ne'er refuse information to in my life." They talked in whispers among themselves, and at length collected their cattle together, and drove them close up to the entrance of the avenue, which might be half a mile distant from the house. They proceeded to drag together some felled trees which lay in the vicinity, so as to make a temporary barricade across the road, about 15 yards beyond the avenue. It was now near daybreak, and there was a pale eastern gleam mingled with the fading moonlight, so that objects could be discovered with some distinctness. The lumbering sound of a coach drawn by 4 horses, and escorted by 6 men on horseback, was heard coming up the avenue. The Highlanders listened attentively. The carriage contained Mr. Jobson and his unfortunate prisoners. The escort consisted of Rashleigh, and of several horsemen, peace officers, and their assistants. So soon as we had passed the gate at the head of the avenue, it was shut behind the cavalcade by a Highlandman, stationed there for that purpose. At the same time the carriage was impeded in its farther progress by the cattle, amongst which we were involved, and by the barricade in front. 2 of the escort dismounted to remove the felled trees, which they might think were left there by accident or carelessness. The others began with their whips to drive the cattle from the road. "Who dares to abuse our cattle?" said a rough voice. "Shoot him, Angus." Rashleigh instantly called out, "A rescue! A rescue!" and firing a pistol wounded the man who spoke. "Claymore!" cried the leader of the Highlanders, and a scuffle instantly commenced. The officers of the law, surprised at so sudden an attack, and not usually possessing the most desperate bravery, made but an imperfect defence, considering the superiority of their numbers. Some attempted to ride back to the hall, but on a pistol being fired from behind the gate, they conceived themselves surrounded, and at length galloped off in different directions. Rashleigh, meanwhile, had dismounted, and on foot had maintained a desperate and single-handed conflict with the leader of the band. The window of the carriage on my side permitted me to witness it. At length Rashleigh dropped. "Will ye ask forgiveness for the sake of God, King James, and old friendship?" said a voice which I knew right well. "No, never," said Rashleigh firmly. "Then, traitor, die in your treason," retorted MacGregor, and plunged his sword in the prostrate antagonist. In the next moment he was at the carriage door, handed out Miss Vernon, assisted her father and me to alight, and dragging out the attorney, head foremost, threw him under the wheel. "Mr. Osbaldistone," he said in a whisper, "you have nothing to fear. I must look after those who have. Your friends will soon be in safety. Farewell, and forget not the MacGregor." He whistled. His band gathered round him, and hurrying Diana and her father along with him, they were almost instantly lost in the glades of the forest. The coachman and postilion had abandoned their horses, and fled at the first discharge of firearms, but the animals, stopped by the barricade, remained perfectly still, and well for Jobson that they did so, for the slightest motion would have dragged the wheel over his body. My first object was to relieve him, for such was the rascal's terror that he never could have risen by his own exertions. I next commanded him to observe that I had neither taken part in the rescue nor availed myself of it to make my escape, and enjoined him to go down to the hall and call some of his party, who had been left there, to assist the wounded. But Jobson's fears had so mastered and controlled every faculty of his mind that he was totally incapable of moving. I now resolved to go myself, but in my way I stumbled over the body of a man, as I thought, dead or dying. It was, however, Andrew Fairservice, as well and whole as ever he was in life, who had only taken this recumbent posture to avoid the slashes, stabs, and pistol balls, which for a moment or two were flying in various directions. I was so glad to find him that I did not inquire how he came thither, but instantly commanded his assistance. Rashleigh was our first object. He groaned when I approached him, as much through spite as through pain, and shut his eyes, as if determined, like Iago, to speak no word more. We lifted him into the carriage, and performed the same good office to another wounded man of his party, who had been left on the field. I then with difficulty made Jobson understand that he must enter the coach also, and support Sir Rashleigh upon the seat. He obeyed, but with an air as if he but half comprehended my meaning. Andrew and I turned the horses' heads round, and opening the gate of the avenue, led them slowly back to Osbaldistone Hall. Some fugitives had already reached the hall by circuitous routes, and alarmed its garrison by the news that Sir Rashleigh, Clerk Jobson, and all their escort, save they who escaped to tell the tale, had been cut to pieces by the head of the avenue by a whole regiment of wild Highlanders. When we reached the mansion, therefore, we heard such a buzz as arises when bees are alarmed, and mustering in their hives. Mr. Jobson, however, who had now in some measure come to his senses, found voice enough to make himself known. He was the more anxious to be released from the carriage, as one of his companions, the peace officer, had, to his inexpressible terror, expired by his side with a hideous groan. Sir Rashleigh Osbaldistone was still alive, but so dreadfully wounded that the bottom of the coach was filled with his blood, and long traces of it left from the entrance door into the stone hall, where he was placed in a chair, some attempting to stop the bleeding with cloths, while others called for a surgeon. No one seemed willing to go to fetch one. "Torment me not," said the wounded man. "I know no assistance can avail me. I am a dying man." He raised himself in his chair, though the damps and chill of death were already on his brow, and spoke with a firmness which seemed beyond his strength. "Cousin Francis," he said, "draw near to me." I approached him as he requested. "I wish you only to know that the pangs of death do not alter one iota of my feelings towards you. I hate you," he said, the expression of rage throwing a hideous glare into the eyes which were soon to be closed forever. "I hate you with a hatred as intense, now while I lie bleeding and dying before you, as if my foot trode on your neck." "I have given you no cause, sir," I replied, "and for your own sake I could wish your mind in a better temper." "You have given me cause," he rejoined. "In love, in ambition, in the paths of interest, you have crossed and blighted me at every turn. I was born to be the honour of my father's house. I have been its disgrace, and all owing to you. My very patrimony has become yours. Take it," he said, "and may the curse of a dying man cleave to it." In a moment after he uttered this frightful wish, he fell back in the chair. His eyes became glazed, his limbs stiffened, but the grin and glare of mortal hatred survived even the last gasp of life. I will dwell no longer on so painful a picture, nor say any more of the death of Rashleigh, than that it gave me access to my rights of inheritance without further challenge, and that Jobson found himself compelled to allow that the ridiculous charge of misprision of high treason was got up on an affidavit which he made with the sole purpose of favouring Rashleigh's views, and removing me from Osbaldistone Hall. The rascal's name was struck off the list of attorneys, and he was reduced to poverty and contempt. I returned to London when I had put my affairs in order at Osbaldistone Hall, and felt happy to escape from a place which suggested so many painful recollections. My anxiety was now acute to learn the fate of Diana and her father. A French gentleman who came to London on commercial business was entrusted with a letter to me from Miss Vernon, which put my mind at rest respecting their safety. It gave me to understand that the opportune appearance of MacGregor and his party was not so fortuitous. The Scottish nobles and gentry engaged in the insurrection, as well as those of England, were particularly anxious to further the escape of Sir Frederick Vernon, who, as an old and trusted agent of the House of Stuart, was possessed of matter enough to have ruined half Scotland. Rob Roy, of whose sagacity and courage they had known so many proofs, was the person whom they pitched upon to assist his escape, and the place of meeting was fixed at Osbaldistone Hall. You have already heard how nearly the plan had been disconcerted by the unhappy Rashleigh. It succeeded, however, perfectly, for when once Sir Frederick and his daughter were again at Lodge, they found horses prepared for them, and by MacGregor's knowledge of the country, for every part of Scotland and the north of England were familiar to him, were conducted to the western sea coast and safely embarked for France. The same gentleman told me that Sir Frederick was not expected to survive for many months a lingering disease, the consequence of late hardships and privations. His daughter was placed in a convent, and although it was her father's wish she should take the veil, he was understood to refer the matter entirely to her own inclinations. When these news reached me, I frankly told the state of my affections to my father, who was not a little startled at the idea of my marrying a Roman Catholic, but he was very desirous to see me settled in life, as he called it, and he was sensible that, in joining him with heart and hand in his commercial labours, I had sacrificed my own inclinations. After a brief hesitation, and several questions asked and answered to his satisfaction, he broke out with, "I little thought a son of mine could have been a lord of Osbaldistone Manor, and far less that he should go to a French convent for a spouse. But so dutiful a daughter cannot but prove a good wife. You have worked at the desk to please me, Frank. It is but fair you should wive to please yourself." How I sped in my wooing, Will Tresham, I need not tell you. You know too how long and happily I lived with Diana. You know how I lamented her, but you cannot know, how much she deserved her husband's sorrow. I have no more of romantic adventure to tell, nor indeed anything to communicate further, since the latter incidents of my life are so well known to those who have shared, with the most friendly sympathy, the joys as well as the sorrows, by which its scenes have been checkered. I often visited Scotland, but never again saw the bold Highlander who had such an influence on the early events of my life. I learned, however, from time to time, that he continued to maintain his ground among the mountains of Loch Lomond, in despite of his powerful enemies, and that he even obtained, to a certain degree, the connivance of government to his self-elected office of Protector of the Lennox, in virtue of which he levied black mail with as much regularity as the proprietors did their ordinary rents. It seemed impossible that his life should be concluded without a violent end. Nevertheless, he died in old age, and by a peaceful death, some time about the year 1733, and is still remembered in his country as the Robin Hood of Scotland, the dread of the wealthy, but the friend of the poor, and possessed of many qualities, both of head and heart, which would have graced a less equivocal profession than that to which his fate condemned him. Old Andrew Fairservice used to say, that there would be many things ower bad for blessing, and ower guide for banning, like Rob Roy. Here the original manuscript ends somewhat abruptly. I have reason to think that what followed relates to private affairs. End of Volume 2, Chapter 22. Recording by Elliott Miller.
Volume 2, Postscript and Notes of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott, Volume 2, Postscript and Notes. Postscript. The second article of the appendix to the introduction to Rob Roy contains two curious letters respecting the arrest of Mr. Graham of Killearn by that daring freebooter, while levying the Duke of Montrose's rents. These were taken from scroll copies in the possession of His Grace the present Duke, who kindly permitted the use of them in the present publication. The novel had but just passed through the press, when the Right Honourable Mr. Peel, whose important state avocations do not avert his attention from the interests of literature, transmitted to the author copies of the original letters and enclosure, of which he possessed only the rough draft. The originals were discovered in the State Paper Office by the indefatigable researches of Mr. Lemon, who is daily throwing more light on that valuable collection of records. From the documents with which the author has been thus kindly favoured, he is enabled to fill up the addresses which were wanting in the scrolls. That of the 21st of November 1716 is addressed to Lord Viscount Townshend, and is accompanied by one of the same date to Robert Pringle, Esquire, Under Secretary of State, which is here inserted as relative to so curious an incident. Letter from the Duke of Montrose to Robert Pringle, Esquire, Under Secretary to Lord Viscount Townshend. Sir, Glasgow, 21st of November 1716. Having had so many dispatches to make this night, I hope ye'll excuse me that I make use of another hand to give you a short account of the occasion of this express, by which I have written to my Lord Duke of Roxburgh and my Lord Townshend, which I hope ye'll get carefully delivered. Mr. Graham, younger of Calern, being on Monday last in Menteith at a country house, collecting my rents, was about 9 o'clock that same night surprised by Rob Roy with a party of his men in arms, who, having surrounded the house and secured the avenues, presented their guns in at the windows, while he himself entered the room with some others with cocked pistols, and seized Calern with all his money, books, papers, and bonds, and carried all away with him to the hills, at the same time ordering Calern to write a letter to me, of which ye have the copy enclosed, proposing a very honourable treaty to me. I must say the story was as surprising to me as it was insolent, and it must bring a very great concern upon me that this gentleman, my near relation, should be brought to suffer all the barbarities and cruelties which revenge and malice may suggest to these miscreants, for his having acted a faithful part in the service of the government, and his affection to me in my concerns. I need not be more particular to you, since I know that my letter to my Lord Townshend will come into your hands, so shall only now give you the assurances of my being, with great sincerity, Sir, your most humble servant, signed Montrose. I long exceedingly for a return of my former dispatches to the secretaries about Methven and Colonel Urquhart, and my wife's cousins, Balnamoon and Finhaven. I must beg you'll give my humble service to Mr. Secretary Methven, and tell him that I must refer him to what I have written to my Lord Townshend in this affair of Rob Roy, believing it was needless to trouble both with letters. Examined, Robert Lemon, Deputy Keeper of State Papers, State Paper Office, November the 4th, 1829. Note, the enclosure referred to in the preceding letter is another copy of the letter which Mr. Graham of Calern was compelled by Rob Roy to write to the Duke of Montrose, and is exactly the same as the one enclosed in his Grace's letter to Lord Townshend, dated November 21st, 1716. R.L. The last letter, in the Appendix No. 2, 28th of November, acquainting the government with Calern's being set at liberty, is also addressed to the Under Secretary of State, Mr. Pringle. The author may also here remark that immediately previous to the insurrection of 1715, he perceives from some notes of information given to government, that Rob Roy appears to have been much employed and trusted by the Jacobite party, even in the very delicate task of transporting specie to the Earl of Breadalbane, though it might have somewhat resembled trusting Don Raphael and Ambrose de la Mella with the church treasure. Notes to Rob Roy, Dugald Chair Moore. Note A. The Grey Stone of MacGregor. I have been informed that at no very remote period it was proposed to take this large stone, which marks the grave of Dugald Chair Moore, and convert it to the purpose of the lintel of a window, the threshold of a door, or some such mean use. A man of the clan MacGregor, who was somewhat deranged, took fire at this insult, and when the workmen came to remove the stone, planted himself upon it with a broad axe in his hand, swearing he would dash out the brains of any one who should disturb the monument. Athletic in person, and insane enough to be totally regardless of consequences, it was thought best to give way to his humour, and the poor madman kept sentinel on the stone day and night, till the proposal of removing it was entirely dropped. Note B. Dugald Chair Moore. The above is the account which I find in a manuscript history of the clan MacGregor, of which I was indulged with a perusal by Donald MacGregor, Esquire, late Major of the 33rd Regiment, where great pains have been taken to collect traditions and written documents concerning the family. But an ancient and constant tradition preserved among the inhabitants of the country, and particularly those of the clan MacFarlane, relieves Dugald Ciar Mhor of the guilt of murdering the youths, and lays the blame on a certain Donald, or Duncan Lean, who performed the act of cruelty, with the assistance of a gillie who attended him, named Charlioch or Charlie. They say that the homicides dared not again join their clan, but that they resided in a wild and solitary state as outlaws, in an unfrequented part of the MacFarlanes' territory. Here they lived for some time undisturbed, till they committed an act of brutal violence on two defenceless women, a mother and daughter of the MacFarlane clan. In revenge of this atrocity, the MacFarlanes hunted them down and shot them. It is said that the younger ruffian, Charlioch, might have escaped, being remarkably swift of foot, but his crime became his punishment, for the female whom he had outraged had defended herself desperately, and had stabbed him with his own dirk in the thigh. He was lame from the wound, and was the more easily overtaken and killed. I always inclined to think this last the true edition of the story, and that the guilt was transferred to Dugald Ciar Mhor as a man of higher name, but I have learned that Dugald was in truth dead several years before the battle, my authority being his representative, Mr. Gregerson of Ardtornish. See also note to Introduction, Legend of Montrose, Volume 6. Note C. The Loch Lomond Expedition. The Loch Lomond Expedition was judged worthy to form a separate pamphlet, which I have not seen, but as quoted by the historian Ray, it must be delectable. On the morrow, being Thursday the 13th, they went on their expedition, and about noon came to Inversnaid, the place of danger, where the Paisley men and those of Dumbarton, and several of the other companies, to the number of 100 men, with the greatest intrepidity leapt on shore, got up to the top of the mountains, and stood a considerable time beating their drums all the while. But no enemy appearing, they went in quest of their boats, which the rebels had seized, and having casually lighted on some ropes and oars hid among the shrubs, at length they found the boats drawn up a good way on the land, which they hurled down to the loch. Some of them, as were not damaged, they carried off with them, and such as were, they sank and hewed to pieces. That same night they returned to Luss, and then next day to Dumbarton, from whence they had at first set out, bringing along with them the whole boats they found in their way on either side of the loch, and in the creeks of the isles, and mooring them under the cannon of the castle. During this expedition, the pinnaces discharging their pateraroes, and the men their small arms, made such a thundering noise through the multiplied rebounding echoes of the vast mountains on both sides of the loch, that the MacGregors were cowed and frighted away to the rest of the rebels, who were encamped at Strathfillan. Ray's History of the Rebellion, Tome 4, page 287. Note D. Author's expedition against the MacLarens. The author is uncertain whether it is worthwhile to mention that he had a personal opportunity of observing, even in his own time, that the king's writ did not pass quite current in the brass of Balquhidder. There were very considerable debts due by Stewart of Appin, chiefly to the author's family, which were likely to be lost to the creditors if they could not be made available out of this same farm of Invernenty, the scene of the murder done upon MacLaren. His family, consisting of several strapping deer stalkers, still possessed the farm, by virtue of a long lease for a trifling rent. There was no chance of any one buying it with such an encumbrance, and a transaction was entered into by the MacLarens, who, being desirous to emigrate to America, agreed to sell their lease to the creditors for £500, and to remove at the next term of Whitsunday. But whether they repented their bargain, or desired to make a better, or whether from a mere point of honour, the MacLarens declared they would not permit a summons of removal to be executed against them, which was necessary for the legal completion of the bargain. and such was the general impression that they were men capable of resisting the legal execution of warning by very effectual means, no king's messenger would execute the summons without the support of a military force. An escort of a sergeant and 6 men was obtained from a Highland regiment lying in Stirling, and the author, then a writer's apprentice, equivalent to the honourable situation of an attorney's clerk, was invested with the superintendence of the expedition, with directions to see that the messenger discharged his duty fully, and that the gallant sergeant did not exceed his part by committing violence or plunder. And thus it happened, oddly enough, that the author first entered the romantic scenery of Loch Kathryn, of which he may perhaps say he has somewhat extended the reputation, riding in all the dignity of danger, with a front and rear guard and loaded arms. The sergeant was absolutely a Highland Sergeant Kite, full of stories of Rob Roy and of himself, and a very good companion. We experienced no interruption whatever, and when we came to Invernenty, found the house deserted. We took up our quarters for the night, and used some of the victuals which we found there. On the morning we returned as unmolested as we came. The MacLarens, who probably never thought of any serious opposition, received their money and went to America, where, having had some slight share in removing them from their pauper regna, I sincerely hope they prospered. The rent of Invernenty instantly rose from £10 to £70 or £80, and when sold the farm was purchased, I think by the late Laird of MacNab, at a price higher in proportion than what even the modern rent authorised the parties interested to hope for. Note E. Alan Breck Stewart. Alan Breck Stewart was a man likely in such a matter to keep his word. James Drummond MacGregor and he, like Kathryn and Petruchio, were well matched for a couple of quiet ones. Alan Breck lived till the beginning of the French Revolution. About 1789, a friend of mine, then residing at Paris, was invited to see some procession which was supposed likely to interest him, from the windows of an apartment occupied by a Scottish Benedictine priest. He found, sitting by the fire, a tall, thin, raw-boned, grim-looking old man, with a petit croix of St. Louis. His visage was strongly marked by the irregular projections of the cheekbones and chin. His eyes were grey, his grizzled hair exhibited marks of having been red, and his complexion was weather-beaten and remarkably freckled. Some civilities in French passed between the old man and my friend, in the course of which they talked of the streets and squares of Paris, till at length the old soldier, for such he seemed and such he was, said with a sigh in a sharp Highland accent, "Dear, any of them is worth the history of Edinburgh." On inquiry, this admirer of Old Reekie, which he was never to see again, proved to be Alan Breck Stewart. He lived decently on his little pension, and had, in no subsequent period of his life, shown anything of the savage mood in which he is generally believed to have assassinated the enemy and oppressor, as he supposed him, of his family and clan. Note F. The Abbess of Wilton. The nunnery of Wilton was granted to the Earl of Pembroke upon its dissolution by the magisterial authority of Henry VIII, or his son Edward VI. On the accession of Queen Mary of Catholic memory, the Earl found it necessary to reinstate the abbess and her fair recluses, which he did with many expressions of his remorse, kneeling humbly to the vestals, and inducting them into the convent and possessions from which he had expelled them. With the accession of Elizabeth, the accommodating Earl again resumed his Protestant faith, and a second time drove the nuns from their sanctuary. The remonstrances of the abbess, who reminded him of his penitent expressions on the former occasion, could wring from him no other answer than that in the text, "Go spin, you jade, go spin." Note G. Mons Meg. Mons Meg was a large old-fashioned piece of ordnance, a great favourite with the Scottish common people. She was fabricated at Mons in Flanders, in the reign of James IV. or V. of Scotland. This gun figures frequently in the public accounts of the time, where we find charges for grease, to grease Meg's mouth withal, to increase, as every schoolboy knows, the loudness of the report, ribbons to deck her carriage, and pipes to play before her when she was brought from the castle to accompany the Scottish army on any distant expedition. After the Union, there was much popular apprehension that the regalia of Scotland and the subordinate palladium Mons Meg would be carried to England to complete the odious surrender of national independence. The regalia, sequestered from the sight of the public, were generally supposed to have been abstracted in this manner. As for Mons Meg, she remained in the castle of Edinburgh, till, by order of the Board of Ordnance, she was actually removed to Warwick, about 1757. The regalia, by His Majesty's special command, have been brought forth from their place of concealment in 1818, and exposed to the view of the people, by whom they must be looked upon with deep associations, and in this very winter of 1828-29, Mons Meg has been restored to the country, where that which in every other place or situation was a mere mass of rusty iron, becomes once more a curious monument of antiquity. Note H. Fairy superstition. The lakes and precipices, amidst which the Avon Dhu, or River Forth, has its birth, are still, according to popular tradition, haunted by the elfin people, the most peculiar but most pleasing of the creations of Celtic superstitions. The opinions entertained about these beings are much the same with those of the Irish, so exquisitely well narrated by Mr. Crofton Croker. An eminently beautiful little conical hill, near the eastern extremity of the valley of Aberfoyle, is supposed to be one of their peculiar haunts, and is the scene which awakens in Andrew Fairservice the terror of their power. It is remarkable that two successive clergymen of this parish of Aberfoyle have employed themselves in writing about this fairy superstition. The eldest of these was Robert Kirk, a man of some talents, who translated the Psalms into Gaelic verse. He had formerly been minister at the neighbouring parish of Balquhidder, and died at Aberfoyle in 1688 at the early age of 42. He was author of The Secret Commonwealth, which was printed after his death in 1691, an edition which I have never seen, and was reprinted in Edinburgh 1815. This is the work concerning the fairy people, in whose existence Mr. Kirk appears to have been a devout believer. He describes them with the usual powers and qualities ascribed to such beings in Highland tradition. But what is sufficiently singular, the Reverend Robert Kirk, author of the said treatise, is believed himself to have been taken away by the fairies, in revenge perhaps for having let in too much light upon the secrets of their commonwealth. We learn this catastrophe from the information of his successor, the late amiable and learned Dr. Patrick Graham, also minister at Aberfoyle, who in his Sketches of Perthshire has not forgotten to touch upon the Dianchi, or men of peace. The Reverend Robert Kirk was, it seems, walking upon a little eminence to the west of the present manse, which is still held a Dunshee, or fairy mound, when he sunk down, in what seemed to mortals a fit, and was supposed to be dead. This, however, was not his real fate. Mr. Kirk was the near relation of Graham of Dochrey, the ancestor of the present General Graham Stirling. Shortly after his funeral, he appeared, in the dress in which he had sunk down, to a medical relation of his own and of Dochrey. "Go," said he to him, "to my cousin Dochrey, and tell him that I am not dead. I fell down in a swoon, and was carried into fairyland where I now am. Tell him that when he and my friends are assembled at the baptism of my child," for he had left his wife pregnant, "I will appear in the room, and that if he throws the knife which he holds in his hand over my head, I will be released and restored to human society." The man, it seems, neglected for some time to deliver the message. Mr. Kirk appeared to him a second time, threatening to haunt him night and day till he executed his commission, which at length he did. The time of the baptism arrived. They were seated at table. The figure of Mr. Kirk entered, but the Laird of Fletcher, by some unaccountable fatality, neglected to perform the prescribed ceremony. Mr. Kirk retired by another door and was seen no more. It is firmly believed that he is at this day in Fairyland. Sketches of Perthshire, page 254. The treatise by Robert Kirk here mentioned was written in the year 1691, but not printed till 1815. Note I. Clachan of Aberfoyle. I do not know how this might stand in Mr. Osbaldistone's day, but I can assure the reader, whose curiosity may lead him to visit the scenes of these romantic adventures, that the Clachan of Aberfoyle now affords a very comfortable little inn. If he chances to be a Scottish antiquary, it will be an additional recommendation to him that he will find himself in the vicinity of the Reverend Dr. Patrick Graham, minister of the Gospel at Aberfoyle, whose urbanity in communicating information on the subject of national antiquities is scarce exceeded even by the stores of legendary lore which he has accumulated. Original note. The respectable clergyman alluded to has been dead for some years. See note H. End of volume 2, postscript and notes. End of Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Recording by Felicity Campbell, Whanganui, New Zealand.